If you've ever mailed off a DNA test to learn where your family came from, this is the kind of result we're talking about. Scientists ran the Sioux Nation's complete DNA against nearly every population on Earth, and one number stopped them cold. 15% of Sioux maternal DNA traces to a genetic group called X2A. That group has never once shown up anywhere in Asia. Its closest matches sit in the Middle East, the Caucasus, and Europe. That is not the answer most people would guess. You know the Sioux as the horse nation, warriors on horseback and buffalo hunters of the northern plains, a culture that feels like it grew straight out of that grass. What almost nobody knows is what's sitting inside their DNA. The Sioux lived thousands of miles from Europe. Their ancestors had no recorded contact with Europe or the Middle East, ever. So how does part of their DNA trace back there? That question went unanswered for decades. We're going to answer it. But first, if mysteries like this are your kind of rabbit hole, hit subscribe. This channel digs up a new one every week. You just need one simple tool to understand what happened next. Every cell in your body has a tiny loop of DNA outside its main nucleus. This is mitochondrial DNA. Unlike most of your DNA, it does not mix between two parents. It passes from mother to child. Generation after generation, it barely changes. Small changes do build up over time, though. Scientists call these changes mutations. They happen at a steady, predictable rate. Follow them far enough back, and you can trace one unbroken line of mothers all the way back tens of thousands of years. Scientists call this a haplogroup. This is not just a science term. It's a real record sitting inside your cells right now, and it holds true for everyone, not just the Sioux. Every person on Earth carries their own version of it. What makes the Sioux case strange is where their record points. For most of the last century, scientists had a simple story about Native American ancestry. Early studies of mtDNA found that almost all Native American mothers' lines fall into 5 main groups. Scientists call them A, B, C, D, and X. 4 of these groups trace cleanly back to Siberia and East Asia. That fit the old story perfectly. People simply walked out of Siberia and settled the whole continent. But mtDNA only tells you about one line, your mother's side. It leaves out almost everything else in your family tree. It could not explain why one of the 5 groups did not fit the story at all. Then, whole genome sequencing entered the conversation, and everything changed. This new method does not read just one line. It reads the entire genetic code passed down from both of your parents, not just your mother's side. And the discovery that broke the case open did not come from a living person. It came from a boy who died 24,000 years ago. In 2012, a team led by scientist S.K. Willerslev studied the DNA of a boy buried near Lake Baikal in Siberia. Scientists call him the Malta boy, or MA1. His DNA showed he belonged to a group called the Ancient North Eurasians. This group was closely related to modern Europeans. It had no direct link to East Asians at all. Then, scientists compared his DNA to modern Native Americans, including the Sioux. 14 to 38% of Native American DNA comes from this ancient North Eurasian group. Native Americans carry 2 separate ancestral origins. That result reopened the mystery of the missing X2A group. Scientists looked closer at where its parent group was strongest today. The picture got stranger. The parent group of X2A shows up across Europe and the Near East, but only at about 2%, except in one group, the Israeli Druze. There, it spikes to 27%. For a while, that number fueled a wild theory that Ice Age hunters crossed the Atlantic Ocean by boat, bringing this DNA straight from Europe. We'll come back to that. Because ruling that theory out took ancient bones, and it took years. The first bone came from western Montana. In 2014, scientists fully studied the DNA of Anzikwan. He was an infant boy, buried 12,600 years ago. His people made Clovis-style stone tools. This is the oldest fully studied ancient genome in the Americas. His DNA traced straight to modern native people of Central and South America. It also matched northern tribes closely. He came from the same Siberian migration as everyone else, with no European DNA and no trace of any trip across the Atlantic. But his DNA still left a gap. It did not show exactly where, in Siberia, this two-part ancestry came together. And it did not explain how a Near East-linked DNA group ended up only in North America. So scientists kept comparing, aiming for the full picture. How does Sioux DNA compare to every group they could test, continent by continent? Start with East Asia, the obvious guess. Scientists compared Sioux DNA to Han Chinese, Japanese, and Korean DNA. They found a deep shared root. Around 36,000 years ago, the ancestors of Native Americans split off from an East Asian group. This happened around the same time the ancestors of Japan's Jomon people also split off, so the two groups are distantly related. But the Sioux carry that ancient North Eurasian signal too, worth 14 to 38% of their DNA, and that same signal is completely missing from Han Chinese DNA today. East Asia explains half the story, not all of it. Something else is folded in. Now, check South Asia. Scientists compared Sioux DNA to people from the Indian subcontinent, like Tajiks and native Indian groups. They found a shared piece of ancestry there too, but not from any direct link between South Asia and the Americas. It's an echo from the same old source. The ancient North Eurasian group gave DNA to the first Native Americans. Much later, it also gave DNA to the early Indo-European people who settled South Asia. Central Asia, home to Mongolians and Kazakhs, shows a medium level of shared DNA. This makes sense on a map. Central Asia was the meeting ground. It's where the East Asian group and the ancient North Eurasian group first mixed. This happened long before either group ever reached Beringia. Then, Siberia splits into two very different stories. Northern Siberian groups, the Yakuts, Evenks, and Buryats, turn out to be closer to the Sioux than East Asians are. Scientists even found two rare samples of the parent X2 group among the Evenks, and that's the only trace of it ever found east of the Altai Mountains. Just two samples from one group in the whole region and nowhere else. It's a thin thread, and on its own, it explains almost nothing. Further down the coast, the Ulchi people of the lower Amur region carry their own piece of the puzzle. Their mitochondrial DNA is the closest living match anywhere on Earth to two of the founding Native American haplogroups, C and D. The Arctic people, the Yupik and Inuit, tell a completely different story. Nearly half of their DNA comes from a separate, much more recent migration. Their ancestors, called Paleo-Eskimos, crossed the Bering Strait only about 5,000 years ago. They carry much less ancient North Eurasian DNA than the Sioux do, the same coastline, but a different chapter of it. None of that solves the actual mystery. The European connection is still sitting there, unexplained. The next clue came from the Altai Mountains. This is where Russia, Mongolia, China, and Kazakhstan meet. Scientists compared Sioux DNA to the Turkic-speaking southern Altaians who live there today. They found a specific mutation on the male line of DNA passed from father to son. Most Native American men carry this same mutation. Scientists found matching maternal DNA too, and they calculated a date. The Altaian line split from the Native American line roughly 13 to 14,000 years ago. That gave the ancestry a location, but it left one big question. The ancestors of the Sioux passed through the Altai, then through Siberia. So why is this strange maternal group never once shown up in any Siberian population, ancient or modern? The answer needed a different kind of clue, the place where the ancestors of the Sioux got stuck along the way. At the height of the last ice age, the ancestors of the Sioux already carried mixed DNA, part East Asian and part ancient North Eurasian. They moved northeast onto the Bering Land Bridge. Scientists call this Beringia. It was a huge stretch of land, now underwater, connecting Siberia and Alaska. There, trapped between two walls of ice, this one population stopped moving completely for roughly 8,000 years. 8,000 years of total isolation is long enough to change a population forever. Every native group in North, Central, and South America today carries one specific genetic marker. Scientists call it the 9-repeat allele. It proves they all come from this same single, stuck founding group. And during this same standstill, something else happened. An old West Eurasian DNA group carried into Beringia by ancient North Eurasian ancestry mutated into something brand new. Scientists call it X2A. The exact group we started this whole story with, the results were clear. The strange DNA that seemed to trace back to Europe and the Middle East actually formed inside Beringia itself. It came from ancient ancestry that had traveled there from the Altai Mountains 20 to 25,000 years earlier. The Sioux's most puzzling DNA signature is not proof of contact with the old world. It's a fossil of a population that stood still at the edge of two continents until the ice finally let them go. Knowing what X2A is does not fully answer what it means, though. A group of DNA that formed while people stood still at the edge of the world, and it still lives inside people today. That raises a different kind of question. One we'll come back to once the rest of the evidence is in. And that same idea, people stuck, then moving back, explains something else, confirmed independently by a totally separate team of scientists. In 2023, researchers studied ancient DNA across northeastern Asia. They found that movement across the Bering Sea never went just one way. Over the last 5,000 years, there were repeated waves of Native American DNA flowing back into Siberia. This DNA traveled more than 1,500 kilometers inland, all the way to the Kamchatka Peninsula on the far eastern edge of Russia. Modern people there today carry roughly twice as much Native American DNA as their ancestors did just 500 years ago. Nobody was even looking to confirm the Beringia story when they ran this test. They were simply mapping unrelated Siberian genomes, and the same conclusion showed up anyway. That brings us back to those Ice Age hunters, the ones who supposedly crossed the Atlantic by boat, carrying this DNA straight from Europe. The strongest proof against that theory came from the opposite coast. The oldest known carrier of the basal, or original form of X2A, is not found in Europe. It's not found anywhere near the Atlantic Ocean. It's Kennewick Man, 9,000 years old, found in Washington State on the Pacific side of the country. If this DNA had crossed the Atlantic by boat, its oldest trace should sit somewhere in the east. Instead, its oldest trace sits on the west coast, thousands of years before anyone claims European contact could have happened. That old theory was a reasonable guess based on an incomplete picture, but the physical evidence points firmly west through Beringia. What this all adds up to is one connected story. Roughly 20 to 25,000 years ago, in the Altai Mountains of southern Siberia, two ancient groups merged, one East Asian, one ancient North Eurasian. Their children moved north. They followed the edges of land that could still support life. They reached Beringia. And they stopped, held in place by ice for 8,000 years. When the ice finally broke, around 15 to 16,000 years ago, this founding group moved south into the Americas. And it split in two. One branch flowed down the Pacific coast. It reached Central and South America. The other branch moved east and inland. It became the ancestors of the Algonquian and Siouan-speaking peoples, including the Sioux. That eastern branch did not start out on the plains. There was a people in Ohio who built huge earthworks 2,000 years ago. Scientists call them the Hopewell. Ancient DNA from Hopewell remains shares close maternal DNA with the modern Southwest Sioux. The people who would become the Sioux were woodland people first. They lived in the Ohio River Valley and around the Great Lakes. Long before anyone rode a horse across a plain, the language backs this up. Linguists have long linked the Sioux language family to two others, Iroquoian and Caddoan, all three tracing to one common ancestor spoken in the southeastern woodlands over 4,000 years ago. Genetics confirmed it. Mitochondrial DNA from Arikara people in South Dakota, who speak a Caddoan language, and ancient Mohawk people in New York, who speak an Iroquoian one, shares the same rare maternal lineages. Two peoples living hundreds of miles apart today, once one and the same. Later, Algonquian-speaking groups expanded west. This pushed the Sioux-speaking people out of that woodland world toward the Great Plains. When horses arrived in the 1700s, the change into the mobile mounted horse nation happened almost overnight, culturally. Genetically, the population stayed exactly the same. It was a full cultural reinvention carried out by the same genetic line that had been walking the story for 20,000 years. That unbroken line reaches all the way to today, and it has a name, Ernie LaPointe. In 2021, a team led by scientist Eska Willerslev faced an almost impossible sample. A lock of hair from Sioux leader-sitting bull, just 5 to 6 centimeters long. It had sat at room temperature for over 100 years. It was also damaged by arsenic, once used to help preserve it. Normal DNA tests need a clean line from mother or father, but Ernie LaPointe's connection to Sitting Bull runs through his mother. That ruled out the normal test completely. So the team spent 14 years building something new, a method that could compare tiny broken pieces of DNA from the hair directly against LaPointe's own DNA. The result came back with a score of 0.1143. That number matches a great-grandson, exactly. For the first time ever, ancient DNA confirmed a direct family link between a historical figure and a living descendant. Now, step back from all of it, and here's the shape of the whole story. Somewhere in a small village in the Altai Mountains of southern Siberia, there are people alive today, and they share a genetic thread with the Sioux Nation, a thread spun 20,000 years ago, 12,000 miles away, through mountains, oceans, and an ice age most of us can barely picture. These two groups have likely never met, but they still carry, inside their own cells, a chapter of the exact same story. And that same thread runs forward too, unbroken, all the way into a single strand of hair, a strand that let one Lakota man prove with a single number that he is his own great-great-grandfather's living descendant. None of this is finished science, though. Geneticists still don't know why the in-between forms of this DNA have never turned up in ancient Siberian remains. That gap keeps a small, honest amount of uncertainty alive, inside an otherwise strong case. There's also a real hole in the record between the Ohio woodlands and the Great Plains. No high-quality ancient genomes exist yet from that exact migration path. So historians and geneticists are filling that gap with language clues and partial evidence for now. But what is solid, repeated by separate research teams over 2 decades, is the core finding. The dual ancestry, the Beringian standstill, the Altai connection, and the unbroken line all the way to a living Lakota family today. The data doesn't ask you to take anyone's word for it. It just keeps saying the same thing every single time someone checks. One question worth sitting with: if you traced your own mother's line back far enough, how many ice ages would it pass through? How many stranded generations? How many quiet decades of standing still before it all made sense? If that's a question you want to keep asking, this channel exists for exactly that. The ancestry no one wrote down, waiting in the DNA the whole time. Subscribe if you want to keep digging.